Now that Philo, speaking for Hume, has laid forth the problem of evil, the power argument and wisdom argument, we now turn to attempts by the other characters to reply back to this. So the character of Clanthys agrees that if Philo can prove that humanity is unhappy or corrupted, it is the end of all religion. Now again, Hume is writing the characters that are saying this, so the words that come out of their mouths are words he puts there. Now DeMeo's reply is the big picture reply. We saw this in Leibniz, but here's the variation that Hume presents, and here's how it goes. And this is a stock reply to the problem of evil. Big picture reply is this: the world is a point in comparison to the universe, and this life, a moment in comparison of eternity. So the present evils, it is claimed, are rectified, corrected, in other regions and in the future. So eyes that are open to larger views of things see the connection of general laws and trace the benevolence of the deity through all mazes and intricacies of his providence. And so the gist of the big picture argument is this: if we look at the individual things that are happening, to use a modern example, we look at, for example, the current pandemic that's occurring as I'm recording this, or we look at more common occurrences, for example, getting the flu, or ending up getting in a car accident, etc., not being able to pay the rent. And so we look at all those individual bad things that happen, but the response is, if you look at the big picture, all this will be worked out in other places and other times. So overall, things will work out, really good. And so it's just our short-sightedness looking at the immediate things that are happening, say to us, the bad things, we lose track of the big picture. But on the big picture, everything is wonderful, and it is good. Therefore, there is no real problem of evil. So that's a big picture reply. It is only our short-sightedness that makes things look bad, but if we had the big picture, we'd see that everything is good, overall, in general. Now, Clanthys also tries to respond, countering the argument by example that Philo is given, namely that everything is terrible, and therefore there's a problem of evil. So Clanthys counters in the following way. His move is to claim that the enjoyments outweigh the pains. And he does agree, and again, Hume is writing this, so the characters are following his rules. Clanthys says, the only way to support divine benevolence, that God is good, is to deny that we humans are in misery and that we're wicked. And so his counter to the argument by example is that these claims about how terrible things are exaggerated. The melancholy views are mostly fictitious, the inferences contrary to fact and experience, that health is more common than sickness, pleasure more common than pain, happiness more common than misery, and for each vexation, each thing that troubles us, he claims we attain 100 enjoyments. And this is a reasonable method to reply back to an argument by example, which essentially is counterexamples, like we saw in argument basics. So Philo's laying out all these terrible things and saying, it's all awful, and Clanthys' response back is, well, no, there are more examples of things being better than being terrible. Therefore, things are not as bad as claimed. Therefore, the problem of evil is countered, because the problem of evil rests in there being evil. So Philo, of course, has a counter to this. Again, Hume is writing this, so Philo is pretty much guaranteed to win. So Philo's counter is, and he's playing within the rules of an argument by example, in assessing this, that his assertion is that Clanthys is wrong, that the original examples, trying to outweigh the pleasure with pain, he says this holds. Pain exceeds pleasure. How so? Well, one of his approaches is this. He's willing to concede or allow, perhaps for the sake of argument, that pain is less frequent than pleasure. But he contends and counters by saying it is infinitely more violent and durable. So his contention is, all right, he says, will allow pain is less common than pleasure. But he's arguing that the pain far outweighs the pleasure. So he asserts that 1 hour of pain often outweighs a month of common enjoyments, and that many spend days, weeks, and months in acute torments. And pleasure hardly ever reaches ecstasy and cannot endure at its highest pitch. Pain often rises to agony and becomes worse the longer it continues, and nothing ends our misery but death. Now this is an empirical argument. So the battle over, is there more pleasure than pain? Is suffering more intense than pleasure? Can it endure longer? And is a method, is something that can be assessed in terms of the empirical facts, although it does require value judgment of weighing things. And so kind of the initial argument is everything is awful, problem of evil. Counter, things are not as bad as Philo claims, things are on the balance pretty good. And Philo's counter is, well, no. Even if we say that pain is less frequent, pain is far worse because it's far more intense and it endures longer. Which again is a matter of empirical debate. Can people sustain high levels of pleasure longer than they can sustain high levels of pain? And in general, Philo seems to be right. One easy way to test this, and this is not Hume talking, this would just be, sort of expanding on the discussion. Think of your favorite dessert, and you have your dessert, say, after a meal. It's really good. And then, you get hungry a little later, you have the same dessert. It's not quite as good, but still pretty good. Now imagine eating that dessert, for every meal, day after day after day. And eventually, you'd get tired of it, typically, and you wouldn't enjoy it as much. So the more you repeat it, the less enjoyable it is. And again, this is easily testable with dessert, which is a fine experiment to run, dessert testing. Now, imagine like a horrible thing, where after every meal, you get smacked with a hammer. Now, that's never going to be, something you just like, oh, well, I'm getting smacked with a hammer, and you just get accustomed to it. It's always going to hurt. So, after a meal, whack, you get whacked in the hand with a hammer. That hurts. Next meal, you get whacked in the other hand with a hammer. That hurts. Next meal, you get whacked in the side with a hammer. That hurts. And then that is just always unpleasant. There's never a point where you just say, well, I've just gotten accustomed to getting hit with a hammer. This is fine. And so his claim essentially is pain is going to exceed pleasure, so problem of evil is still a problem. Now Philo continues his argument. He claims, and again this can be disputed, that there is no foundation for religion unless human life is happy. That existing in this world with the pains, infirmities, vexations, and follies is desirable. And again, this is quite an assumption, because his claim is that, the assumption is that religion, as he sees it, is based on the idea that God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, and unless this, cashes out, so things are good and not evil, then religion should be tossed aside. And there are many ways to counter this. One possibility is, of course, just to say, well, that's not how it works. It's not about happiness. It's about other things. And so having a world of suffering is perfectly compatible with God. Now, he claims that this is contrary to everyone's feelings, this idea that human life is happy. How so? Well, he gives an argument essentially from experience and authority, that everyone is an authority in this because we all suffer, and this establishes that it is decisive, that the pain is, and suffering, the evil is quite real and terrible, and hence it cannot be refuted according to him. So going back to the start, it's an argument from authority where all of us have the authority in our own suffering. Next reply is sort of a, in a way a concession, but in a way not, as we'll see. Philo says, this is not what we'd expect. And he does admit we can't really estimate and compare all pains and pleasures in the lives of everyone and all animals, all creatures that feel pleasure and pain. And his first attack is this. If we base religion on a point forever uncertain, it is made equally uncertain. So if someone says, oh yes, there's proof that God exists because, he's all good, all powerful, knowing, things are great, so believe in God. And Hume's counter here is, well, we don't really know that, so we really can't be sure about God's existence. But then he's willing to allow, for the sake of argument, which is an acceptable move in philosophy. Namely, if you're arguing against someone, you can legitimately concede them points and say, I'll allow you this for the sake of argument, and then you would argue against them on some other point. So what is he conceding? Well, he's willing to say that even if we allow that animal or human happiness in this life exceeds the misery, that it comes out, ahead, that if you were able to somehow, tally it all up and do a, pleasure pain analysis and show, there's a slight balance of happiness over misery. But he says this wouldn't be good enough. Why not? Well, this is not what we would expect from infinite power, infinite wisdom, and infinite goodness. Why not? Well, he closes his argument the following way, which is an excellent question. Why would there be any evil at all? Why is there any misery at all? So his argument essentially is that even if we were to show that, there's more happiness than misery, why have any misery at all? Now, if we accept God, it cannot be by chance. Now, if a person doesn't believe in God, why is there misery? Well, I could say it's, a random universe. Stuff happens that makes people miserable, and that's just the way randomness and chance works. But if we have God in charge, then there must be some cause. So he brings up the problem again, presenting it in his final point. Since God is perfectly benevolent, all good, is it contrary to his intention? But it cannot be contrary to his intention, since he's supposed to be almighty. So he's supposed to be all-powerful, he is omnipotent. And so the point of his argument essentially is, the nature of the argument is, well, if God is totally good, then there shouldn't be any evil at all. It can't be contrary to his intention because he's all-powerful. So Hume closes not by saying there's no God. He doesn't say God doesn't exist. His closing points are these. He says the only way to attack the problem of evil, as he presents it, is a counter I mentioned before, that this subject exceeds all human comprehension, and there are common measures of truth and falsehood are not applicable. And this was a move that was used prior to Hume and used after, to simply say, okay, yes, by our standards, everything seems, does seem to be evil, but we simply cannot understand God, and we can't apply our standards of truth and falsehood because God is beyond us, so there is no problem. And that would be an option, provided one accepts that you just can't apply any standards to God, which is certainly a possibility. Now, Hume presses forward, speaking through Philo. He does allow that pain or misery in us is compatible with infinite power and goodness in God. He says this is not logically impossible. So he's willing to allow this, to accept this, to concede this, that you could possibly have, a perfectly good God with pain and misery in humans. But what's his reply to this? He says back, the mere possible compatibility is not sufficient. Why? Well, essentially it's an inference argument. He's, attacking the idea that people can look at the world as we know it and then infer from our experience the existence of a perfect God. So he says the pure, unmixed, and uncontrollable attributes must be shown solely from the mixed and confused phenomena. In other words, we can't infer a perfect God from an imperfect world, but that's what we'd have to do. And he says, even if the phenomena were pure and unmixed, being finite, he claims, they would be insufficient proof. Now this could be countered by contending that the universe is infinite, an infinite reality. And he says that, but if we look at the world, it is definitely not pure and unmixed. It is jarring and discordant. So there are insufficient. Now again, his argument is not there is no God. He doesn't conclude that. He says, if you look at the world and try to infer a perfect being from it, you're not going to get that from an imperfect world. Not impossible, but the inference is really weakly supported, perhaps not supported at all. So he finishes up, which could be with a remark that could be seen as either kind of sarcastic and mocking or serious. And we don't have a recording of his tone, so we don't know exactly what he's doing here. So here's what he concludes, speaking through Philo. There is no view of human life from which we can infer the moral attributes or learn the infinite benevolence, infinite power, and infinite wisdom which must be discovered by faith alone. Now later thinkers, like our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, make a similar sort of view, but they're being serious about it. As we'll see when we talk about Kant, he says, yeah, you can't prove God's existence, you can't disprove it, so faith can guide you. And so Hume, depending on his tone, might be saying, oh yes, this is a perfectly viable option. It can be known only by faith. Or he could be being kind of, snarky and sarcastic, essentially saying, yeah, there's no way to get this through reason, so the only option is, faith. Ha. So, which is the truth about his view? Well, we don't know for sure. Some would, of course, push that he's being sarcastic, others would say not. So that takes us through Hume and the problem of evil. Next, we'll turn to look at Hume and the immortality of the soul, and why you probably don't have either.